Caroline woke up a little earlier than usual that Saturday. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, filling the room with a warm glow, as if the day promised to be ordinary and peaceful. Silence filled the house. The sounds of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen mixed with the singing of birds outside. Next to her on the bed, Daniel was sleeping. His face looked so peaceful, so relaxed as he gently hugged her waist. It seemed like nothing could disturb this moment of tranquility. But this moment was deceptive. When Caroline reached for her phone on the nightstand, her gaze immediately fell on a pop-up notification. It was a message from their bank. It looked just like dozens of others she was used to seeing, but her attention was drawn to one word: warning. Caroline propped herself up, trying not to wake her husband, and looked at the screen. The balance of their joint account had significantly decreased. The amount she saw was so large that it took her breath away. Her heart raced as she blinked, trying to focus on the numbers. "Maybe it's a mistake," she whispered to herself, but her inner voice was already raising the alarm. Without wasting time, Caroline quietly got out of bed, trying not to wake Daniel. She went to the living room, her legs feeling like cotton. There at the kitchen table, she opened her laptop. Her fingers trembled as she logged into the banking system to view the full account statement. With each scrolled line, her confusion turned into cold horror. Several large transfers made over the past few days pointed to an unknown account. These were not ordinary expenses. They were carefully calculated withdrawals. "What is this?" she whispered, feeling something inside her break. Caroline knew that Daniel would never make such spending decisions without discussing them with her. He had always been attentive to their finances, but these transactions, they looked like something hidden, something deliberate. Her intuition, which she often ignored in the past, was now screaming. Returning to the bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed. Daniel was still sleeping, his face as calm as every morning. But now there was something unsettling in that calm. Who was he really? The man with whom she shared a home, shared a life? Did she really know him? She reviewed their conversations in her memory, trying to remember if he had said anything that could explain these actions. He had always been so confident, so convinced of his decisions. Maybe he did it for their future? Or was it something more? Something she couldn't even imagine? Caroline spent the rest of the morning sitting in the kitchen, staring into space. She couldn't wait. When Daniel woke up, his usual good morning seemed fake, as if she now saw him in a different light. "We need to talk," she said in an even voice. "Did something happen?" he asked, picking up his coffee mug and putting on his usual smile, the one that used to make her feel protected. She handed him the printed bank statement. Daniel frowned, his gaze falling on the documents. At first, his expression was confused, but then it changed to something else, to concern. "What is this?" he asked, trying to sound confident. "This is our joint account. And you emptied it, Daniel," she said, her voice firm but filled with pain. "I want to know why." "It's not what you think," he hurried to say, avoiding her gaze. "I was going to tell you. It's for something important." "Something important? You stole money from our account. Without discussion, without warning," her voice rose. "What were you even thinking?" He set the mug aside and stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rougher. "It was a necessity." "A necessity? For whom? For you?" Her voice trembled with rage. Suddenly, Daniel stepped closer to her, and she instinctively stepped back. His face contorted into an expression she had never seen before. "Do you think you can control everything?" he said. "You have no idea what it's like to take care of someone, of a whole family." Caroline felt her heart stop for a second. There was a hidden threat in his words, and for the first time, she felt vulnerable before him. Her gaze fell on his hands, which were clenched into fists. "What are you hiding, Daniel?" she whispered. Before he could answer, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the room, breaking the tense silence. Caroline froze, her heart pounding. Who could it be? Her gaze met his, and she saw something like panic in his eyes. "I'll get it," he said quickly, heading for the door. But she stopped him. "No, I will," she said, her voice firm. When she opened the door, she was met by two police officers in uniform. Their serious expressions immediately told her that this was not just a casual visit. "Mrs. Miller?" one of them asked. Yes, that's me, she replied, her voice trembling. We need to speak with your husband. It's about financial fraud, the officer said. She turned to Daniel, whose face had turned ashen. What is this? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. But deep down, she already knew that the answer to this question would change everything. Question for the reader. How far would you go to find out the truth about those you love? Caroline froze in place as Daniel clenched his teeth, his gaze darting between the police officers and his wife. Seconds stretched like hours. Her heart pounded as if anticipating something inevitable. The two officers standing at the threshold maintained their composure, but their tense postures betrayed their readiness for the worst. Mr. Miller, began one of them, a tall man with a serious face, we have reason to believe that you are involved in illegal activities related to financial fraud. We need you to come with us to the station to give a statement. This is some kind of mistake, Daniel snapped, his voice trembling, but he tried to sound confident. I didn't do anything. Caroline felt her legs weaken. She grabbed the doorframe to maintain her balance. Daniel, what do they mean? Her voice was quiet but had a steely edge. He didn't answer. His face tensed, and his gaze avoided hers. At that moment, she realized that he wouldn't tell the truth, or perhaps he was too afraid to say it. The police officer stepped forward, holding a folder with documents. We have evidence of large sums being transferred to offshore accounts, he continued. We have also established a connection between these transactions and your company. It's not what you think, Daniel defiantly threw out. I didn't do anything illegal. But his words sounded too hasty, too uncertain. He was caught, and it was clear to everyone in the room. Mr. Miller, it would be better for you to come with us voluntarily, the female officer warned. Her calm but firm tone made it clear that he had no choice. Daniel looked at Caroline, and his gaze was a mix of anger and despair. It seemed like he wanted to say something that could justify his actions, but the words stuck in his throat. The police officers slowly stepped forward, ready to escort him. Wait! Caroline suddenly cried out, her voice filled with contradictions. Can you explain to me what's going on? Why is my husband being arrested? The police officer looked at her with an expression full of sympathy, but his words were merciless. Mrs. Miller, we can't disclose all the details at this stage. However, we are confident that your husband made deliberate actions to transfer funds that he couldn't explain legally. These funds are linked to a financial fraud investigation. No, that's impossible, she muttered, her voice trembling. Daniel, tell them it's a mistake. Tell me it's a mistake. But he remained silent. His face was still tense, and his hands involuntarily clenched into fists. This silence was louder than any words. The officers handcuffed Daniel. Caroline watched the scene, unable to believe that her world was crumbling before her eyes. The man with whom she shared her life, with whom she built plans for the future, now stood before her in handcuffs like a criminal. I'll explain everything to you, Caroline, he said suddenly, his voice almost pleading. It's not what you think. I did it for us, for the family. She felt her hands clench into fists. For us? Her voice trembled with anger. You took our savings. You ruined everything we built, and you call it for us? You don't understand, he whispered. Then explain it to me, she snapped. Explain it to me right now, because I can't believe your words anymore. But before he could answer, he was led out of the house. Caroline remained standing at the doorway, her breathing ragged, her thoughts chaotic. She felt the weight of what was happening pressing down on her. Her perfect life had been just an illusion. When the police and Daniel left, the silence of the house became almost unbearable. Caroline stood in the living room, hugging herself as if trying to hold herself together. She couldn't just sit and wait. She needed to know the truth. She opened her laptop again, returned to the bank statement, and began digging into every detail that could shed light on what was happening. The more she delved, the more she saw inconsistencies, strange transactions, and hidden transfers. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberate scheme. Her gaze stopped on one name that kept popping up in the documents. Peter Grayson. This name was unfamiliar to her, but it figured in several transfers as the recipient. Her intuition told her that this name was key. Caroline found the strength to call her old friend, lawyer Mason Crawford. She knew he was the only one who could help her sort out the legal aspects of this situation. "Caroline, I just heard the news," Mason said when he picked up the phone. "Is it true? Was Daniel arrested?" "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet but full of determination. "I need your help. I can't figure out what he got himself into, but I know it's related to our account and someone named Peter Grayson." "Peter Grayson?" Mason echoed, and his voice suddenly tensed. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Why? Do you know him?" Her voice filled with concern. "He's not just anyone, Caroline," he replied. "That name is linked to several major financial fraud cases. If Daniel was working with him, the situation could be much more serious than you think." After the call with Mason, Caroline felt like the last remnants of her former world were crumbling. Now she couldn't ignore reality. Everything she believed in, everything she thought was reliable, was based on a lie. She needed to put all the pieces together to understand how she ended up in the center of this nightmare. But along with the feeling of betrayal, something else was born within her. Determination. If Daniel had gotten himself into this, if he had ruined their lives, she was obligated to find out the whole truth. And she was obligated to do it not only for herself, but also for those years she lost believing in a lie. Question for the reader. What would you do if the person you trusted the most turned out to be the main source of your pain? Caroline couldn't sleep that night. Everything that had happened in the last 24 hours swirled in her head. Her world, once stable and predictable, was now completely shattered. On the kitchen table lay papers, bank statements, notes from her conversation with lawyer Mason Crawford, and a single sheet with a name, Peter Grayson. She tried to connect all these pieces, but the answers eluded her. Who was this man? How was he connected to Daniel? And why did her husband, always so organized and calculating, get involved in something that risked destroying their lives? In search of a distraction, Caroline turned on her laptop again. She logged into Daniel's old email, which he had probably forgotten to delete. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through his correspondence. The emails looked innocent, until she found a folder named Project Grayson. Opening it, she froze. There were dozens of emails, contracts, and documents related to investments that Daniel had clearly hidden from her. Her gaze fell on one email with the subject, Final Scheme for Transfer of Funds. Caroline couldn't believe her eyes as she read the content. It was a detailed instruction on how to bypass financial regulation laws and transfer money to offshore accounts. Signed, P. Grayson. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands beginning to tremble. "Daniel, what have you done?" The next morning, Caroline met with Mason in his cozy office downtown. His face was serious as she placed the printed emails in front of him. "This is worse than I thought," he said, quickly scanning the documents. "Peter Grayson is known for using such schemes. He's not just a fraudster, he's a predator. He finds people who are already desperate or in difficult situations and involves them in his crimes." "But Daniel," Caroline began, her voice trembling. "He was never like that. I mean, yes, he could be secretive, but this doesn't seem like him." Mason sighed, leaning back in his chair. "People change, Caroline. Sometimes circumstances force them to do things they would never have done before, and sometimes they just deceive us from the start." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. She couldn't afford weakness. "What do I do now?" she asked. "How can I protect myself?" Mason leaned forward, his tone serious. "First, you need to prepare for the fact that this case could drag on. Daniel involved you in this, even if you knew nothing. But most importantly, Caroline, you need to find answers. If you can prove that you weren't involved, that will be your only chance to come out of this clean." Upon returning home, Caroline was met with an unexpected message. On her phone was an anonymous note. "If you want to know the truth about Daniel, meet me at 7 p.m. at the cafe on Willow Street. Signed, G. Double quote." Her heart stopped. Who could this be? G. Grayson or someone else? She didn't know if she should go, but the feeling of desperation and the desire to know the truth overcame her fear. When she entered the dim, cozy cafe, it was almost empty. In the far corner sat a middle-aged man, graying hair and a stern expression. It was Gregory, Daniel's former colleague. "Gregory?" she asked, approaching. He nodded, gesturing for her to sit. Thanks for coming, Caroline. I thought you wouldn't want to see me. I'm here to find out the truth, she said, crossing her arms. You said in your message that you know something about Daniel. Gregory smiled slightly, but his face remained serious. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything surfaced. Daniel had been working with Grayson long before you met him. He got your husband involved in his schemes, promising wealth and success, but it was all a trap. Grayson always uses people and then leaves them to deal with the consequences. Caroline felt her head spin. Are you saying Daniel was part of this from the beginning? Gregory shook his head. I think he became a victim, but the problem is that now he's their tool, and if he starts talking, they won't let him live. Caroline left the cafe with a new wave of questions. She couldn't understand how long her life had been part of this lie. But one thing was clear. She had to find out more. Her husband might have been a victim, but that didn't justify what he had done to her. That evening, she returned to her laptop. She studied the documents, looked at old photos and letters, trying to find any clue that could shed light on Daniel's actions. She remembered how he once mentioned that his old phone was still in a drawer in their bedroom. Maybe there were answers there. With trembling hands, she took out the device and began searching. Old messages, notes, photos, and suddenly she found a password-protected folder. Her heart raced faster. She tried several codes, and finally one worked. Their wedding date. Inside the folder were documents proving the worst. Daniel wasn't just working with Grayson. He was actively helping him launder money and hide evidence. She also found an email where he mentioned her name. Caroline knows nothing, but if necessary, I can use her as a cover. Tears streamed from her eyes. He had used her. He had built their life on lies and was willing to destroy it for his own gain. Caroline closed the laptop and wiped away her tears. She couldn't allow herself to be a victim anymore. Her husband had betrayed her, ruined their future, and dragged her into a crime she knew nothing about. I won't let him destroy me, she whispered, her voice trembling with anger. But there was determination in it. She dialed Mason's number. I need your help. I'm ready to testify. Question for the reader. If you discovered that your loved one had used you as a cover for their crimes, could you forgive them, or would you choose the path of justice? Caroline sat across from Mason in his stern office again. His face was serious as he examined the new documents she had brought. Among them were copies of Daniel's correspondence with Grayson and records of offshore accounts. Her breath caught every time she heard the lawyer confirm her worst fears aloud. These materials are a goldmine, Caroline, he said, setting the documents aside. If the police see all this, it will not only put Daniel behind bars, but also expose an entire network of criminals. But this also puts you in danger. You need to be very careful. Her hands tightly gripped the handle of her bag as she absorbed his words. Caution seemed to no longer help. Every step she took brought her closer to the edge of the abyss. I want to protect myself, Mason, she said, her voice trembling. But I also want the truth to come out. Daniel must answer for everything. Are you sure you're ready for this? Mason asked, his gaze penetrating. Once you take the first step, there's no turning back. Yes, she said, nodding. I'm ready. I have no other choice. Later that day, Caroline met with Detective Harris at the police station. His stern gaze softened when he saw her. He knew what she had been through. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Miller, he said, offering her a seat. We've reviewed your documents, and this is exactly what we need to start a formal investigation. So can you protect me? She asked, her voice full of hope. We'll do everything we can to ensure your safety, he assured her. But you need to understand that those Daniel is involved with will stop at nothing to protect themselves. You need to be prepared for any surprises. These words, though true, made her heart race. She couldn't avoid the feeling of fear, but she also knew that living in fear was no longer an option. Caroline returned home later than she had expected. Her home, which had once been her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every corner reminded her of Daniel, of the life they had built together, and of the lies that held it all together. When she entered, she saw that the light in Daniel's study was still on. He was sitting at his desk, his face tense, and his hands nervously flipping through the pages of some folder. He hadn't heard her come in, and she stood in the doorway, watching him. Her gaze fell on his phone, which lay next to his computer. The screen was flashing with a new notification. She approached quietly, her steps cautious. "You're late," he said, finally noticing her. His voice was sharp, almost accusatory. "I had a tough day," she calmly replied, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "And you?" He looked up at her, and his eyes were full of tension. "Work as always," he dryly said, putting the folder away in a drawer and locking it. Her heart raced faster. What was he hiding? What else didn't she know? The next day, Caroline received a message from Gregory. It was short but insistent. "I found something important. We need to meet." She agreed, though she knew that every meeting with him could be dangerous. They met in a secluded place outside the city. Gregory looked even more tense than the last time. "Daniel is in trouble, Caroline," he began, handing her a flash drive. "Everything is here. Financial transactions, names of people he worked with, and even confirmations of meetings with Grayson." "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice wary. "Because I can't stay silent anymore," he replied. "And because I know these people won't stop unless they're exposed." Carolyn handed the flash drive to Detective Harris, and the police began to act. They set up surveillance on Daniel, trying to gather more evidence of his crimes. Every step Caroline took brought her closer to the truth, but it also intensified the danger. One night as she sat at home, her phone rang. It was Daniel. "Caroline," he began, his voice low and cold. "We need to talk." "About what?" she asked, her heart skipping a beat. "You're hiding something from me," he said. "I know it. You've been acting strange." She tried to stay calm. "You're the one hiding something, Daniel," she replied. "I'm just trying to figure out what's really going on." There was silence on the other end, but she could hear his heavy breathing. "You don't understand what you're getting into, Caroline," he finally said. "You have no idea how dangerous this is." She felt a cold fear run down her spine. "If that's the case, then maybe you can explain it to me." Her voice became firm, despite the tremor inside. Daniel didn't answer. He hung up the phone. Caroline knew she had to act faster. With each passing day, the pressure mounted, and she realized that the final confrontation with Daniel was inevitable. She could no longer allow him to manipulate her or hide the truth. But what was he planning? And could she withstand what was to come? The evening was surprisingly quiet. Caroline sat in her living room, feeling the tension build with each passing hour. The light was dim, and the faint scent of coffee she had brewed but never drank lingered in the air. Her phone vibrated on the table, and she jumped, though she had been expecting this call all day. On the screen was the name Detective Harris. She took a deep breath before answering. "We're ready, Caroline," he said. "It's all happening tomorrow. Are you sure you can do this?" Her hand gripped the phone tighter. She knew this was her chance to put an end to the lies and manipulations of Daniel. But fear tore her apart from within. "Yes," she said softly but firmly. "I'm ready." Harris told her the final details of the plan. Daniel would be lured to a prearranged meeting where he would believe he was closing another major deal. But instead of business partners, police officers would be waiting, ready to arrest him red-handed. "Just be careful," Harris warned. "Daniel is dangerous. If he suspects anything, everything could go wrong." Carolyn decided to spend the evening as if nothing had happened. She set the table, preparing dinner that Daniel had always loved. When he entered the house, his face was tense, but seeing the atmosphere, he relaxed a bit. "What's the occasion?" he asked, nodding at the dinner. "I just felt like having a quiet evening," she replied with a soft smile. "Don't we deserve a little peace?" He sat down across from her, his gaze intently studying her face. She knew he suspected something, but she hoped her mask of calm would hold. "You were out somewhere today?" he asked, taking a wine glass. His tone was casual, but his eyes held tension. "Where could I have been?" She smiled, taking a sip of wine. "I was home. Didn't you notice?" He nodded, but his face showed doubt. Caroline felt her heart pounding, but she held herself back, not letting him notice her nervousness. The next day, Caroline woke up early. Her hands trembled as she tied her scarf, preparing to leave. She knew today's meeting would be decisive. Daniel, unaware of this, was also getting ready for his important meeting. "Have a good day," she said, trying to sound natural as he left the house. He nodded, giving her a quick glance, and disappeared through the door. As soon as he left, she grabbed her phone and texted Harris. "He's on his way. Meet him there." Caroline sat in her car not far from the meeting place. Harris had insisted that she be nearby to make sure everything went according to plan. She watched as Daniel parked at the warehouse, his steps confident, his face focused. She watched as he entered the building, unable to bear the sight. The man before her was no longer the man she had once loved. He was a stranger, a liar, a manipulator, a criminal. She turned away, unable to watch as he was led inside. Harris and his team were waiting inside. As soon as Daniel began negotiations, officers burst in, presenting him with an arrest warrant. His face contorted with anger and fear as he realized he had been caught in a trap. "This is a mistake," he shouted as he was led away in handcuffs. "You can't prove anything." But his words sounded too hasty, too uncertain. He had been caught, and everyone in the room knew it. "Mr. Miller, it would be better for you to come with us voluntarily," the female officer warned. Her calm but firm tone made it clear that he had no choice. Caroline thought everything was over when she received a message from Harris. "Daniel has been arrested. Everything went smoothly." But her relief was short-lived. As she was returning home, she received a call from Gregory. "Carolyn," he said, his voice tense, "we missed something. Daniel had a plan in case of his arrest. You need to leave the house immediately." "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Just trust me," he said. "I can't explain everything over the phone. Get out of there now." Before she could process his words, she noticed a black car pulling up to her house. Two men got out, their faces hidden, and they were clearly looking for her. Caroline instantly realized this was no coincidence. She started the car and drove away without looking back. Her world had been turned upside down again. The truth about Daniel was much scarier than she could have imagined. She contacted Harris, telling him about the situation. He promised to ensure her safety, but she knew she couldn't trust anyone but herself now. Her life would never be the same again. She had fought for the truth, but that truth came at an unexpected cost. The engine of her car roared as she sped away from her home. Caroline knew she was in danger. Whoever these men were, they weren't just watching her. They had come for her. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, but she couldn't afford to be distracted. Only when she reached a busy intersection did she glance at the screen. "Harris." "Where are you?" His voice was sharp. "We saw two men watching your house. They're part of the group Daniel was working for. They think you know more than you should." "What do I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Drive to my station. We'll provide you with protection. But be careful." Caroline nodded, though he couldn't see her. She knew this nightmare wasn't over yet. When she arrived at the police station, she was immediately taken to Harris's office. On the desk in front of him lay a thick file, a stack of documents she hadn't seen before. "There's something you need to know before we proceed," Harris said, opening the file. "Daniel wasn't just a con artist. He was working for a criminal syndicate, laundering their money. But here's the scary part." He pulled out a photograph and placed it in front of her. It was an image of Daniel, taken in a restaurant with a man she didn't recognize. But the caption under the photo made her blood run cold. "William Grant, syndicate financier." "Wait, Grant?" Caroline felt her breath catch. "But that's my mother's maiden name." Harris looked at her intently. "Yes, and we checked. He's your uncle. He was connected to Daniel, and he's the one who ordered your elimination if you became a problem." Caroline's world spun. All this time she had been fighting against Daniel, not knowing that her own family was also involved in this. I can't believe this," she whispered. Harris offered her protection, but Caroline knew that if she simply hid, her life would never be the same. She made an unexpected decision. She would find William Grant herself and make him tell the truth. With Harris's help, she found out that he was at his country house. She drove there, not warning anyone. If she was going to get answers, she had to do it herself. When she entered the house, he was already waiting for her. "You came after all," he said, pouring himself a whiskey. "I thought you were smarter than that. You wanted to kill me?" Her voice was cold but filled with inner turmoil. "No, Caroline, you misunderstood. Daniel crossed the line. He took more than he should have. And you just got caught in the crossfire. If you hadn't gotten involved, you would have been safe. And you justify this." She took a step closer. "You watched as my life was ruined." He sighed and set the glass down on the table. "You have no idea what it's like to be in this world. Even if you tell the whole world the truth, it won't stop the system. You just need to accept it. But Caroline wasn't going to give up. She had already prepared. In her pocket was a hidden microphone, and Harris and his team were already listening to every word. "I won't accept it," she said. "I'll expose you. I'll expose all of you." The door burst open, and FBI agents rushed in, ready to arrest him. William Grant tried to escape, but he was quickly tackled to the ground and handcuffed. "You'll regret this, Caroline," he hissed as he was led away. She didn't respond. She just watched as he was taken away, knowing that it was finally over. Days later, the news was everywhere. Headlines blared. Wife exposes husband's fraud and criminal syndicate. Caroline Miller helps FBI dismantle major money laundering scheme. But even after all that, she felt no relief. Her life had been shattered. She had lost her husband, her trust in her family, and her past. But she had gained something greater: freedom. Harris came to her that evening when it was finally all over. "You did it, Caroline," he said, looking at her with genuine admiration. "You exposed them. Now you can start over." She looked at him and smiled, for the first time in a long time, genuinely. "Yes, I can." She didn't know what awaited her next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control of her destiny. 3 months passed. Caroline finally started a new life. She moved to a different city, found a new job. Everything seemed finally calm. But one morning, as she walked into a cafe for coffee, her heart stopped. In the corner, at a table, sat Daniel. He looked at her and smiled. "Miss me?" Question for the reader. What would you do if the past you tried to leave behind suddenly returned?